Good morning, everyone. It's a good pleasure to me to be afforded the opportunity of sharing some points of my research in colonial history, and I'm very grateful to LSE Research Showcase. My research project at the III, the International Inequalities Institute, Social Change and Racial Inequalities in the Post-Slavery Societies, 19th, 21st centuries, is primarily based on a comparative and historical analysis of the all-pervasive socio-racial inequalities in Jamaica, Guadeloupe and Martinique since the abolitions of slavery. I am particularly interested in enlightening the means of resistance or social contestation used and developed throughout a long-term period in order to fight for an actual social change, an actual social emancipation, able to erase inequalities established on colonial slavery after slavery was abolished, nonetheless in different contexts across this space. This orientation then takes us to the analysis of social movements in social history that I have been passionate about since my previous research at the Université des Antilles on decolonization and social change in the French West Indies from 1946 to 1961. Today, I'm going to present to what extent I've been led to use some concepts from the sociology of social movements. These points of discussion combine my previous research with the outlooks of my current research project. The first point concerns the concept of political opportunity structure and the strike of June 1948 in Guadeloupe. In a second time, I'm going to talk about the linkage between the cycles of claims or protests and the emergence of social mobilizations through the strike of 1948 in Guadeloupe, but particularly with the strike of 1959 in Jamaica. Opening the question of tactical repertoire of action used by trade unions in the Caribbean plantation societies, but in a specific context determined by the decolonization. When I talk about the concept of political opportunity structure, I'm talking about the concept developed by social movement scholars since the 1970s, such as Singer, Creasy, or Kitchers, for example. As Gamson and Mayer has indicated, the political opportunity structure should not be narrowed as simple political institutions or the relationships among political actors. As Doug McAdam has also pointed out, the broad sense, which enables the large acceptance of the concept, can ironically constitute a limit and can dispossess it of its entire relevance. There is a danger to see the concept used irrelevantly each time scholars aim to discuss the question and the link between social movements and the political environment in which these movements emerge from. Having said that, what can I bring to this discussion as a historian, this discussion about political opportunity structure? I would say just a little case of single study coming from an historical analysis. And this case is the strike of June 1948 in Guadeloupe, occurring in the sugar industry. Let me start by the context. Following the arrival of the Third Republic in France in 1875, the main political aspiration of the colored people became the claim for political assimilation of the colonies of Guadeloupe and Martinique as complete French departments. This claim, nevertheless, has to face an institutionalized colonial culture shared by almost French politics and policymakers in a context marked by the ideology of racism supported by scientific paradigms worldwide. Then, only the context of the end of World War II helped this claim to come back to the political agenda with a much better consideration. In fact, multiple factors led to the vote of the law of assimilation by the parliament in France on 19 March 1946. But a huge discrepancy appeared between the visions of the French government and the socio-political forces in action in Guadeloupe and Martinique. This assimilation was unanimously considered as an actual opportunity to support the emergence of a social change in two Caribbean societies, Caribbean plantation societies, highly affected by huge socio-racial inequalities inherited from colonial slavery. It's also very important to note that the socio-political forces in action at this time were the Communist Party and the CGT Workers' Union, Confédération Générale du Travail, which worked together following a French pattern predominant. In such circumstances, the struggle for political assimilation in the late 1940s went with the emergence of a new cycle of social demands from 1944. Some scholars have illuminated the significance of this new collective mindset, identified as a collective aspiration for a better standard of living, pervading the lower as well as the middle classes. Also, the first measures in application of the law of assimilation were finally taken in March 1948, after 2 years. This is a broad context in which emerged the strike of June 1948 in Guadeloupe, and in my opinion, two of the four dimensions implied in the political opportunity structure, according to Macadam, have to be taken into account to understand this specific mobilization. These two dimensions are firstly the relative openness or closure of the institutionalized political system. Secondly, the state's capacity or propensity for repression. Two dimensions interconnected with each other in our case. Let me try to explain it. The archives of the councils of ministers in France in 1948 shows that the government early decided not to apply the social legislation and the social welfare in the new departments. Though these social measures represented the main expectations at the local scale. The archives of the press released by CGT trade unions and the two communist parties in Guadeloupe and Martinique demonstrate that the militants were perfectly aware of the closure displayed by Robert Schumann's government since February 1948. Nevertheless, a reverse openness was clearly expressed by the government representative at the local scale with the first prefect in office in Guadeloupe, Gilbert Philipson. Gilbert Philipson was a former official in the administrative apparatus of the Free Front during the war. Since the Conference of Brazzaville, organized by de Gaulle in 1944, he had integrated this emerging idea of a new policy, a new social policy, to be implemented in the colonies in order to improve the conditions of living of the masses. When Philipson arrived in Guadeloupe in January 1948, he invited CGT executives to sit in a commission created for the attribution of minimum wages for Guadeloupean plantation workers. The CGT started to consider the opportunity offered by an institutionalized procedure. Additionally, the executives successfully asked the cane cutlers and all plantation workers to not take any task and work on plantations before an agreement would be reached on new wages. Thus, a temporary agreement was found on 16 March 1948 between the trade union and Philipson to launch the 1948 sugar campaign. The main point of this agreement, nonetheless, was the guarantee of the application of new wages determined by the commission mentioned above once this commission would have finished to inquire into the question. However, Philipson actually faced a total closure in the Ministry of Labour and Social Welfare directed by Daniel Maël in France. The latter had already warned the prefect in their correspondence in January 1948 that the determination of minimum wages was not supported by any legislation in France at that time. Furthermore, in February and March, he refused most of the salary proposal sent by Philipson. Philipson wanted to take into account the claims raised by CGT activists. The turning point was the refusal of any new variation in wages in Guadeloupe during the sugar campaign, affirmed by Daniel Maël, despite the local agreement of March 1948. I'm talking about the agreement between Philipson and the trade unions. Parallelly, the CGT activists, who also considered the closure of the government in Paris in their action, remained on alert. In April, the grassroots tried to mobilize some plantation workers in two important factories, probably in order to pressure Philipson and the determination of the minimum wages. And fourth, the end of the story is not that hard to guess. At the end of the harvest, on 10 June 1948, relying on three important bastions belonging to the Communist Party in Guadeloupe, the grassroots of the CGT activists launched a huge mobilization of plantation workers, which turned into a general strike in the sugar industry, then formalized by the executives on 17 June. This observation of a general strike in Guadeloupe in the month of June is something very unique. And this emergence of a mobilization at this moment of the harvest can only be explained by the promise made by Philipson early in March 1948. In regard to the political opportunity structure, the openness of Philipson also appears as a main factor because he did not try to use police forces and repression to resolve the conflict, unlike the prefect in office in Martinique, the other French department. Moreover, after the strike, Gilbert Philipson's policy evolved toward this general closure of the government to the claims raised by the CGT. He finally used police forces and surveillance, confirming his previous state of openness in 1948. Also, maybe symbolically, I don't know, he married the daughter of an executive director factory on 27 June 1949. That said, the strike of June 1948 in Guadeloupe leads to another point of discussion noted by Macadam in his discussion of political opportunity structure, which is the link existing between the emergence of a mobilization and a cycle of protests that we should not overlook. Even more exciting is that my recent investigations in the UK National Archives on social movements in Jamaica after World War II give me the opportunity to also discuss this point by considering now the strike of 1959 in Jamaica. The time does not allow me to expound all the details about this analysis, which remain at its starting point, but I would like to share some outlooks and questions with you. Firstly, also the openness of Gilbert Philipson obviously encouraged the strike in the sugar industry in 1948. The mobilization of workers was also motivated by the emergence of a cycle of claims since 1944. Actually, the plantation workers in Guadeloupe had benefited from important increases in 1946, then in 1947, until the tiny increase imposed by the minister Daniel Mayer in March 1948. Therefore, the mobilization in June 1948 has also to be considered in the pursuance of this cycle of claims, which legitimated this social action as well. Then, my second point in regard to the role played by cycles of claims in the emergence of mobilizations concerns the strike of 1959 in Jamaica. The report of the Commission of Inquiry on the Sugar Industry in Jamaica, ordered by the Governor Blackburn in January 1960, after the strike, provides an official statement of the labor relations from 1940 to 1960 in Jamaica. These labor relations were organized around two main actors. On the one hand, the Sugars Manufacturers Association, the SMA, and on the other hand, the main trade worker union in Jamaica, the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union, the BITU. Given the political context organized in Jamaica around two major political parties, so on the one hand, the Jamaica Labour Party, the GLP, created by Alexander Bustamante as well. On the other hand, we have the People's National Party, the PNP, created by Norman Manley. Another trade union, the Workers' National Union, belonging to the PNP, became another bargaining agent in these labor relations in 1954. From 1941 to 1958, therefore, a series of agreements between the SMA and the Workers' Union regulated labor relations and brought several improvements to workers on sugar estates. In fact, the correspondence between the labor advisor and the governor between 1945 and 1947, along with a documentation of the, presenting the negotiation of wages in 1951, indicates a fundamental point. Most of these agreements between 1941 and 1958 in Jamaica were taken under the pressure and the strength of the trade unions, supported, like in the French Antilles, by a new social aspiration for better conditions of living. As a report of the arbitration in 1951 published in the Jamaica Gazette insists, since 1940, labor disorders occurred frequently prior to the annual crop until 1948, when a comprehensive agreement affecting approximately 42,700 workers was negotiated between the SMA and the BITU. What do you think happened next? The strike of 1959. At the end of the sugar crop 1958, the SMA refused for the first time the payment of crop bonus since several years. The dispute went to the arbitration tribunal on December 1958, while agitation started to affect workers at Frome and Appleton estates. However, on the 3rd February 1959, the tribunal awarded no bonus for the sugar crop 1958, imperiling at the same time the negotiations for the 1959 sugar crop. At this moment, the claims identically formulated by the three unions over their rivalry became much more important, denying the inability of the industry to grant an increase, and arguing that the large majority of sugar workers had received less than a subsistence wage. Under the action of the grassroots militants, strikes began at Worthy Park, the Canfield and Intwood estates, before the leaders of trade unions finally and formally called a strike on 14 March only on 3 estates. They ordered the continuance of the 3 unauthorized strikes already in effect and asked workers at the other estates to remain at work and to keep perfect discipline. The resumption of work was issued by the unions on 31 March 1959 on the undertaken by the Chief Minister Norman Manley from the PNP to appoint a commission of inquiry and the guarantee brought by the SMA that no worker would be victimized because of the strike. Having said that, and considering both the case of the strike of 1948 in Guadeloupe and the case of the strike of 1959 in Jamaica, in my opinion, a few questions can emerge with regards to the social movements in the Caribbean plantation societies after World War II in the context of the decolonization. These questions, I believe, have to be investigated further. Firstly, there is a question of the linkage between a cycle of claims or protests already open and the emergence of strong mobilizations of workers, whereas their involvement can be structurally challenged by the high degree of unemployment or underemployment inherent in a sugar plantation economy. Secondly, there is a question of the tactical repertoire of action of the trade unions in this context. It seems to be interesting to determine when the unions prioritize their involvement in institutionalized procedures and when they opt for strike actions. But which type of actions? Slowdowns, work stoppages, lockouts. This point also leads to the relationship between the leaders of trade unions and the grassroots militants. In Guadeloupe in 1948 and in Jamaica in 1959, the executives pretended that they had nothing to do with the development of localized actions. Is that true? Another example regarding the question of tactical repertoire of action concerns the means deployed to assure the involvement of the workers in these plantation societies. In Guadeloupe, in Martinique, as well as in Jamaica, common practices can be observed with, for instance, the important use of sticks to prevent workers from accessing plantations and factories. This associated with the blockade of strategic roads with wood and stones. There is much more to discuss. It would have afforded me much pleasure had time permitted me to have talked about the concept of the framing process in the socio-political movements in the 1950s in Guadeloupe and Martinique, even more the process of their social transformation and the state of equilibrium argued by Talcott Parsons to understand the typology of social change that characterizes these islands. However, I have now to put an end to the discussion. Thank you very much to all of you for your attention.